Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will be exploring the concept of progressive overload and if it really needs to be applied to a training program for athletes. First and foremost, we need to establish what exactly we mean when referring to progressive overload. Progressive overload is essentially the concept of making training harder over time. This can be thought of in a short-term sense, such as making training more difficult from week to week, from an intermediate sense, such as making training more difficult from one mesocycle to the next, or even from a long-term sense, such as making training more difficult from year to year. There are many different ways that progressive overload can be applied, and the method implemented is specific to what our training goal is. For example, we may want to increase the load lifted over time for strength training, or we may want to increase the distance we can run at a certain pace for endurance training. Progressive overload can be applied by manipulating the following variables: increasing volume, increasing intensity, reducing rest periods, increasing effort, and different variations and combinations of these. Progressive overload is the most fundamental concept of physical training, but why is it such an important principle that needs to be followed to actually progress? Well, essentially, training must become more difficult over time to allow continual adaptations to training. If we always perform the exact same training, we will simply remain in the same physical condition. So we need to consistently make training harder so that the body has a reason to change. Now that we understand what progressive overload is and why it is important for athletes, we need to understand the difference between overloading training and progressive overload. As we already established, progressive overload refers to making training harder over time. However, overloading training is a slightly different concept. Overloading training refers to training that is stimulative enough to provide adaptation. There is a minimum level of stimulus required to actually cause adaptation, and if we don't train with the stimulus that's great enough, we won't adapt from it. For example, most people walk multiple kilometers per day, but don't experience an endurance training effect because daily walking simply isn't a strong enough stimulus to cause an adaptation. So as long as we are training with sufficient overload stimulus, the athlete will recover and adapt to this and improve their performance. Therefore, when they train that quality again, they will be able to perform at a higher level than before. Let's now explore how progressive overload can be applied and if it really needs to be prescribed in a training program at all. As we've now established, an athlete will adapt to a stimulus if it is overloading. This means that once they recover and adapt, they can perform at a higher level than previously. So the next time they train that quality, they can actually push harder than before, and so on. This means that they can actually perform harder training over time without necessarily changing any variables. So we can keep training variables the same for an entire mesocycle and let performance naturally improve as an adaptation to training. For example, if an athlete performs a back squat for 3 sets of 100 kilos in a given session, they should naturally improve the number of reps performed on average over a 5-week mesocycle, because they are getting stronger from the training stimulus. Or if an athlete performs 5 maximal effort 20-meter sprints, for example, they should become slightly faster over time as they are adapting to the stimulus. So what if the athlete doesn't actually improve performance over time? Then we need to understand why this is the case and change some training variables to make sure we are still providing overloading training. If an athlete isn't improving, there are a few things we can check. Before changing any variables, we need to make sure the athlete is putting in sufficient effort into the current training. For example, we would need to ensure that an athlete is putting maximal effort into sprint training and allowing full recovery, or they are taking strength training close enough to failure. Next, we need to make sure that we aren't doing too much volume. If the total workload of the training program, in combination with the athlete's sport practice, is so high, they may be in a constantly fatigued state and therefore cannot recover and adapt to training very well. In this scenario, training volume should be reduced to allow more recovery. And the last step we can implement if the previous 2 boxes have been checked is to increase volume. If the athlete is putting sufficient effort into their training and recovering well, then they may simply need a greater dose of training. The initial training stimulus may not have been overloading for the athlete, so a greater dose can allow training to now be strong enough to provide adaptation. In this case, we can increase the total weekly volume of the particular quality that the athlete is struggling to improve. So, if we don't necessarily need to actually apply progressive overload, how can we periodize training over time to reach peak condition at a specific time of the year? To do this, we can change the emphasis of each quality over time from more general to more specific. For example, let's say we have 4 mesocycles of training where we want to train the qualities of speed, power, and strength. As we can see here, speed training uses shorter distances initially to emphasize acceleration ability and gradually increases in distance over time to emphasize max velocity sprinting. Power training uses heavier loads further, initially to emphasize force output, then transitions to lighter loads to emphasize velocity. And strength training may use lighter loads to emphasize structural adaptations and gradually transition to heavier loads to emphasize force output. With each mesocycle, progressive overload doesn't need to be applied as they will improve at the specific quality they are training, but the emphasis shifts over time to train slightly different qualities. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.